Chapter 20. The moral and social degradation of the colored population of the Southern States is attributable to two main causes: their mode of living and their religion. In treating upon these causes, and especially the latter, I feel confident that I shall throw myself open to the criticism of a numerous, if not an intelligent class of the people upon whom I write. The entire absence of a knowledge of the laws of physiology amongst the colored inhabitants of the South is proverbial. Their small, unventilated houses, in poor streets and dark alleys, in cities and towns, and the poorly built log huts in the country, are often not fit for horses. A room 15 feet square, with 2 and sometimes 3 beds, and 3 or 4 in a bed, is common in Tennessee. No bathing conveniences whatever, and often not a wash dish about the house, is the rule. The most inveterate eaters in the world, yet these people have no idea of cooking outside of hog, hominy, cornbread, and coffee. Yes, there is one more dish. It is the Negro's sunflower in the South: cabbages. It is usual to see a woman coming from the market about 5 o'clock in the evening, with a basket under her shawl, and in it a piece of pork, bacon, or half a hogshead, and 1 or 2 large heads of cabbage, and some sweet potatoes. These are put to cook at once, and the odour from the boiling pot may be snuffed in some distance off. Generous to a fault, the host invites all who call in to stop to supper. They sit down to the table at about 9 o'clock, spend fully an hour over the first course, then the apple dumplings, after that the coffee and cake. Very few vegetables, except cabbages and sweet potatoes, are ever used by these people. Consequently, they are not unfrequently ill from a want of the knowledge of the laws of health. The assembling of large numbers in the cities and towns has proved fatal. Nearly all the statistics relating to the subject now accessible are those coming from the larger Southern cities, and these would seem to leave no doubt that in such centres of population the mortality of the colored greatly exceeds that of the white race. In Washington, for instance, where the Negroes have enjoyed longer and more privileges than in most Southern cities, the death rate per thousand in the year 1876 was for the whites 26.537, for the colored 49.294, and for the previous year it was a little worse for the blacks. In Baltimore, a very healthy city, the total death rate for 1875 was 21.67 in 1,000, of which the whites showed 19.80, the colored 34.42. In a still healthier little city, Chattanooga, Tennessee, the statistics of the last 5 years give the death rate of the whites at 19.9, of the colored 37. The very best showing for the latter, singularly enough, is made in Selma, Alabama. It stands per 1,000, white 14.28, colored 18.88. In Mobile, in the same state, the mortality of the colored was just about double the rate among the whites. New Orleans for 1875 gives the record of 25.45 for the death rate of the whites, to 39.69 for that of the colored. Lecturers of their own race, male and female, upon the laws of health is the first move needed. After settling the question with his bacon and cabbage, the next dearest thing to a colored man in the South is his religion. I call it a thing because they always speak of getting religion as if they were going to market for it. "You better go and get religion, that's what you better do, for the devil will be out of you one of these days, and then where will you be?" said an elderly sister who was on her way to the revival at St. Paul's in Nashville last winter. The man to whom she addressed these words of advice stopped, raised his hat, and replied, "Annie, I ain't quite ready tonight, but I'm going to get it before the meetings close, 'cause when that getting up day comes, I want to have the witness, that I do." "Yes, you better, for if you don't there'll be a mighty stir 'mong the brimstone down there, that they will, for you's been bad enough. I knows you from a izzard," returned the old lady. The church was already well filled, and the minister had taken his text. As the speaker warmed up in his subject, the sisters began to swing their heads and reel to and fro, and eventually began to shout. Soon 5 or 6 were fairly at it, which threw the house into a buzz. Seats were soon vacated near the shouters to give them more room, because the women did not wish to have their hats smashed in by the frenzied sisters. As a woman sprung up in her seat, throwing up her long arms with a loud scream, the lady on the adjoining seat quickly left, and did not stop till she got to a safe distance. "Uh-huh," exclaimed a woman near by. "'Fraid of your new bonnet. Ain't got much religion, I reckon. 'Spects you'll have to come out of that if you want to save your soul." "She thinks more of that hat now than she does of a seat in heaven," said another. "Never mind," said a third. "When she gets the witness, she'll drop that hat and shout herself out of breath." The shouting now became general, a dozen or more entering into it most heartily. These demonstrations increased or abated according to movements of the leaders who were in and about the pulpit, for the minister had closed his discourse, and first one and then another would engage in prayer. The meeting was kept up till a late hour, during which 4 or 5 sisters, becoming exhausted, had fallen upon the floor and lay there, or had been removed by their friends. St. Paul is a fine structure, with its spire bathed in the clouds, and standing on the rising land in South Cherry Street, it is a building that the citizens may well be proud of. In the evening I went to the First Baptist Church in Spruce Street. This house is equal in size and finish to St. Paul. A large assembly was in attendance, and a young man from Cincinnati was introduced by the pastor as the preacher for the time being. He evidently felt that to set a congregation to shouting was the highest point to be attained, and he was equal to the occasion. Failing to raise a good shout by a reasonable amount of exertion, he took from his pocket a letter, opened it, held it up, and began, "When you reach the other world, you'll be hunting for your mother, and the angel will read from this paper. Yes, the angel will read from this paper." For fully 10 minutes the preacher walked the pulpit, repeating in a loud, incoherent manner, "And the angel will read from this letter." This created the wildest excitement, and not less than 10 or 15 were shouting in different parts of the house, while 4 or 5 were going from seat to seat, shaking hands with the occupants of the pews. "Let that angel come right down now and read that letter," shouted a sister, at the top of her voice. This was the signal for loud exclamations from various parts of the house. "Yes, yes, I wants to hear the letter. Come, Jesus, come, or send an angel to read the letter. Lord, send us the power." And other remarks filled the house. The pastor highly complimented the effort as one of great power, which the audience most cordially endorsed. At the close of the service, the strange minister had hearty shakes of the hand from a large number of leading men and women of the church, and this was one of the most refined congregations in Nashville. It will be difficult to erase from the mind of the Negro of the South the prevailing idea that outward demonstrations such as shouting, the loud amen, and the most boisterous noise in prayer, are not necessary adjuncts to piety. A young lady of good education and refinement, residing in East Tennessee, told me that she had joined the church about a year previous, and not until she had one shouting spell did most of her sisters believe that she had the witness. "And did you really shout?" I inquired. "Yes, I did it to stop their mouths, for at nearly every meeting one or more would say, 'Sister Smith, I hope to live to see you show that you got the witness, for where the grace of God is, there will be shouting, and the sooner you comes to that point, the better it will be for you in the world to come.'" To get religion, join a benevolent society that will pay them sick dues when they are ill, and to bury them when they die, appears to be the beginning, the aim, and the end of the desires of the colored people of the South. In Petersburg, I was informed that there were 32 different secret societies in that city, and I met persons who held membership in 4 at the same time. While such associations are of great benefit to the improvident, they are, upon the whole, very injurious. They take away all stimulus to secure homes and to provide for the future. As a man observed to me, "I belongs to 4 societies, the Samaritans, the Galilean fishermen, the Sons of Moses, and the Wise Men of the East. All of these pays me $2 a week when I is sick, and $25 to bury me when I dies. Now ain't that good?" I replied that I thought it would be far better if he put his money in a home and educated himself. "Well," said he, "I's satisfied, 'cause if I put the money in a house, maybe when I got sick some other man might be hanging round wanting me to die, and maybe the old woman might want me gone too, and not take good care of me, and let me die and let the town bury me. But now, you see, the society takes care of me and buries me. So now I am all right for this world, and I has got the witness, and that fixes me for heaven." This was all said in an earnest manner, showing that the brother had an eye to business. The determination of late years to ape the whites in the erection of costly structures to worship in, is very injurious to our people. In Petersburg, Virginia, a Baptist society pulled down a noble building, which was of ample size, to give place to a more fashionable and expensive one, simply because a sister church had surpassed them in putting up a house of worship. It is more consistent with piety and godly sincerity to say that we don't believe there is any soul-saving and God-honoring element in such expensive and useless ornaments to houses in which to meet and humbly worship in simplicity and sincerity the true and living God, according to his revealed will. Poor labouring people who are without homes of their own, and without, in many instances, steady remunerative employment, can ill afford to pay high for useless and showy things that neither instruct nor edify them. The manner, too, in which the money is raised is none of the best, to say the least of it. For most of the money, both to build the churches and to pay the ministers, is the hard earnings of men in the fields, at service, or by our women over the wash tub. When our people met and worshipped in less costly and ornamental houses, their piety and sincerity was equally as good as now, if not better. With more polish within and less ornament without, we would be more spiritually and less worldly minded. Revival meetings, and the lateness of the hours at which they close, are injurious to both health and morals. Many of the churches begin in October, and continue till the holidays; and commencing again the middle of January, they close in April. They often keep the meetings in till 11 o'clock, sometimes till 12, and in some country places they have gone on later. I was informed of a young woman who lost her situation, a very good one, because the family could not sit up till 12 o'clock every night to let her in, and she would not leave her meeting so as to return earlier. Another source of moral degradation lies in the fact that a very large number of men, calling themselves missionaries, travel the length and breadth of the country, stopping longest where they are best treated. The missionary is usually armed with a recommendation from some minister in charge, or has a forged one. It makes but little difference which. He may be able to read enough to line a hymn, but that is about all. His paper that he carries speaks of him as a man gifted in revival efforts, and he at once sets about getting up a revival meeting. This tramp, for he cannot be called anything else, has with him generally a hymn book and an old faded worn-out carpet-bag with little or nothing in it. He remains in a place just as long as the people will keep him, which usually depends upon his ability to keep up an excitement. I met a swarm of these lazy fellows all over the South, the greatest number, however, in West Virginia. The only remedy for this great evil lies in an educated ministry, which is being supplied to a limited extent. It is very difficult, however, to induce the uneducated, superstitious masses to receive and support an intelligent Christian clergyman. The great interest felt in the South for education amongst the colored people often produce scenes of humor peculiar to the race. Enjoying the hospitality of a family in West Virginia, I was not a little amused at the preparation made for the reception of their eldest son, who had been absent 6 months at Wilberforce College. A dinner with a turkey, goose, pair of fowls, with a plentiful supply of side dishes and apple dumplings for dessert, was on the table at the hour that the son was expected from the train. An accident delayed the cars to such an extent that we were at the table and dinner half through, when suddenly the door flew open, and before us stood the hope of the family. The mother sprang up, raised her hands, and exclaimed, "Well, well, if dar ain't Peter now! The Lord bress dat child, eh? And how college like he seems! Just look at him, don't he look edicated? Come right here this minute and kiss your mammy." During this pleasant greeting, Peter stood near the door where he had entered. Dressed in his college rig, small cap on his head, bag swung at his side, umbrella in the left hand, and a cigar in the right, with a smile on his countenance, he looked the very personification of the Harvard student. The father of the family, still holding his knife and fork, sat with a glow upon his face, while the two youngsters, taking advantage of the occasion, were helping themselves to the eatables. At the bidding, "Come and kiss your mammy," Peter came forward and did the nice thing to all except the youngest boy, who said, "I can't kiss you now, Pete. Wait till I eat these dumplings, then I'll kiss you." Dinner over, and Peter gave us some humorous accounts of college life, to the great delight of his mother, who would occasionally exclaim, "Bress dat chile, what a hard time he must have dere at the college, and how dem boys worries him. Well, people's got to undergo a heap to get book learning, don't they?" At night, the house was filled to see the young man from college. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21. In the olden time, ere a blow was struck in the rebellion, the whites of the South did the thinking, and the blacks did the work. The master planned, and the slave executed. This unfitted both for the new dispensation that was fast coming, and left each helpless without the other. But the Negro was the worst off of the two, for he had nothing but his hands, while the white man had his education, backed up by the lands that he owned. Who can wonder at the Negro's improvidence and his shiftlessness, when he has never had any systematic training, never been compelled to meet the cares of life? This was the black man's misfortune on gaining his freedom, and to learn to save and to manage his own affairs appeared to all to be his first duty. The hope of everyone, therefore, seemed to centre in the Freedmen's Saving Bank. "This is our bank," said they, and to this institution the intelligent and the ignorant, the soldier fresh from the field of battle, the farmer, the day laborer, and the poor washerwoman, all alike brought their earnings and deposited them in the Freedmen's Bank. This place of safety for their scanty store seemed to be the hope of the race for the future. It was a stimulus for a people who had never before been permitted to enter a moneyed institution except at his master's heels, to bring or to take away the bag of silver that his owner was too proud or too lazy to tote. So great was the negro's wish to save, that the deposits in the Freedmen's Bank increased from $300,000 in 1866 to $31 million in 1872, and to $55 million in 1874. This saving of earnings became infectious throughout the South, and the family that had no bank book was considered poorly off. These deposits were the first installments toward purchasing homes, or getting ready to begin some mercantile or mechanical business. The first announcement, therefore, of the closing of the Freedmen's Saving Bank had a paralyzing effect upon the blacks everywhere. Large numbers quit work. The greater portion sold their bank books for a trifle, and general distrust prevailed throughout the community. Many who had purchased small farms or cheap dwellings in cities and towns, and had paid part of the purchase money, now became discouraged, surrendered their claims, gave up the lands, and went about as if every hope was lost. It was their first and their last dealings with a bank. These poor people received no sympathy whatever from the whites of the South. Indeed, the latter felt to rejoice, for the Negro obtained his liberty through the Republican party, and the Freedmen's Bank was a pet of that party. The Negro is an industrious creature. Laziness is not his chief fault, and those who had left their work returned to it. But the charm for saving was gone. No more banks for me. I'll use my money as I get it, and then I'll know where it has gone to, said an intelligent and well-informed colored man to me. This want of confidence in the saving institutions of the country has caused a general spending of money as soon as obtained, and railroad excursions, steamboat rides, hiring of horses and buggies on Sabbath, and even on week days, has reaped large sums from colored people all over the South. Verily, the failure of the Freedmen's Saving Bank was a national calamity, the influence of which will be felt for many years. Not satisfied with robbing the deluded people out of the bulk of their hard earnings, commissioners were appointed soon after the failure, with appropriate salaries, to look after the interest of the depositors, and these leeches are eating up the remainder. Whether truly or falsely, the freedmen were led to believe that the United States Government was responsible to them for the return of their money with interest. Common justice would seem to call for some action in the matter. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22. Those who recollect the standing of Virginia in days gone by will be disappointed in her at the present time. The people, both white and black, are poor and proud, all living on their reputation when the Old Dominion was considered the first state in the Union. I viewed Richmond with much interest. The effect of the late rebellion is still visible everywhere, and especially amongst those who were leaders in society 30 years ago. I walked through the market and observed several men with long black cloth cloaks, beneath which was a basket. Into this they might be seen to deposit their marketing for the day. I noticed an old black man bowing very gracefully to one of these individuals, and I inquired who he was. "Ah, massa," said the negro, "dat is Major. He was berry rich before de war, but de war fotch him right down, and now he ain't able to have servants, and he's too proud to show his basket, so he covers it up in his cloak." and then the black man smiled and shook his head significantly and walked on. Standing here in the marketplace, one beholds many scenes which bring up the days of slavery as seen by the results. Here is a girl with a rich brown skin. After her comes one upon whose cheek a blush can just be distinguished, and I saw one or two young women whose cream-like complexion would have justly excited the envy of many a New York belle. The condition of the women of the latter class is most deplorable. Beautiful almost beyond description, many of them educated and refined, with the best white blood of the South in their veins, it is perhaps only natural that they should refuse to mate themselves with coarse and ignorant black men. Socially they are not recognized by the whites. They are often without money enough to buy the barest necessities of life. Honorably, they can never procure sufficient means to gratify their luxurious tastes. Their mothers have taught them how to sin. Their fathers they never knew. Debauched white men are ever ready to take advantage of their destitution, and after living a short life of shame and dishonor, they sink into early and unhallowed graves. Living, they were despised by whites and blacks alike. Dead, they are mourned by none. I went to hear the somewhat celebrated Negro preacher, Rev. John Jasper. The occasion was one of considerable note, he having preached, and by request, a sermon to prove that the sun do move, and now he was to give it at the solicitation of 45 members of the Legislature, who were present as hearers. Those who wanted the sermon repeated were all whites, a number of whom did it for the fun that they expected to enjoy, while quite a respectable portion, old fogey in opinion, felt that the preacher was right. On reaching the church I found 12 carriages and 2 omnibuses, besides a number of smaller vehicles, lining the street half an hour before the opening of the doors. However, the whites who had come in these conveyances had been admitted by the side doors, while the streets were crowded with blacks and a poorer class of whites. By special favour I was permitted to enter before the throng came rushing in. Members of the Legislature were assigned the best seats. Indeed, the entire centre of the house was occupied by whites, who, I was informed, were from amongst the FFVs. The church seats 1,000, but it is safe to say that 1,200 were present at that time. Rev. John Jasper is a deep, black, tall and slim, with long arms and somewhat round-shouldered, and 65 years old. He has preached in Richmond for the last 45 years, and is considered a very good man. He is a fluent speaker, well versed in Scriptures, and possesses a large amount of wit. The members of Jasper's church are mainly freedmen, a large number of whom are from the country, commonly called cornfield niggers. The more educated class of the colored people, I found, did not patronize Jasper. They consider him behind the times, and called him old fogey. Jasper looked proudly upon his audience, and well he might, for he had before him some of the first men and women of Virginia's capital. But these people had not come to be instructed. They had really come for a good laugh, and were not disappointed. Jasper had prepared for the occasion, and in his opening service saved himself by calling on Brother Scogan to offer prayer. This venerable brother evidently felt the weight of responsibility laid upon him, and discharged the duty, at least to the entire satisfaction of those who were there to be amused. After making a very sensible prayer, Scogan concluded as follows: "O Lord, we's a mighty abused people. We's had a hard time in slavery. We's been all broken to pieces. We's bow-legged, knock-kneed, bandy-shanked, cross-eyed, and a great many of us is hump-backed. Now, Lord, we wants to be mended up, and we wants you to come and do it. Don't send an angel, for this is too big a job for an angel. You made us, O Lord, and you know our wants, and you can fix us up as nobody else can. Come right down yourself, and come quickly." At this sentence Jasper gave a loud groan, and Scogin ceased. After service was over, I was informed that when Jasper finds any of his members a little too long-winded in prayer, singing, or speaking, he gives that significant groan, which they all well understand. It means enough. The church was now completely jammed, and it was said that 2,000 people sought admission in vain. Jasper's text was, "God is a God of war." The preacher, though wrong in his conclusions, was happy in his quotations, fresh in his memory, and eloquently impressed his views upon his hearers. He said, "If the sun does not move, why did Joshua command it to stand still? Was Joshua wrong? If so, I had rather be wrong with Joshua than to be right with the modern philosophers. If this earth moves, the chimneys would be falling, tumbling in upon the roofs of the houses, the mountains and hills would be changing and levelling down, the rivers would be emptying out. You and I would be standing on our heads. Look at that mountain standing out yonder. It stood there 50 years ago when I was a boy. Would it be standing there if the earth was running round as they tell us?" "No, blessed God!" cried a sister. Then the laugh came, and Jasper stood a moment with his arms folded. He continued, "The sun rises in the east and sets in the west. Do you think anyone can make me believe that the earth can run around the world in a single day, so as to give the sun a chance to set in the west? No, sir-ree, that doctrine don't go down with Jasper." At this point the preacher paused for breath, and I heard an elderly white in an adjoining pew say in a somewhat solemn tone, "Jasper is right, the sun moves." Taking up his bandana and wiping away the copious perspiration that flowed down his dusky cheeks, the preacher opened a note which had just been laid upon the desk, read it, and continued. "A question is here asked me, and one that I am glad to answer, because a large number of my people, as well as others, can't see how the children of Israel were able to cross the Red Sea in safety, while Pharaoh and his hosts were drowned. I have told you again and again that everything was possible with God, but that don't seem to satisfy you. Those who doubt these things that you read in Holy Writ are like the infidel, won't believe unless you can see the cause. Well, let me tell you, the infidel says that when the children of Israel crossed the Red Sea, it was in winter, and the sea was frozen over. This is a mistake, or an intentional misrepresentation." Here the preacher gave vivid accounts of the sufferings and flight of the children of Israel, whose case he likened to the colored people of the South. The preacher wound up with an eloquent appeal to his congregation not to be led astray by these new fangled notions. Great excitement is just now taking hold of the people upon the seeming interest that the colored inhabitants are manifesting in the Catholic religion. The cathedral in Richmond is thrown open every Sunday evening to the blacks, when the bishop himself preaches to them, and it is not strange that the eloquent and persuasive voice of Bishop Keene, who says to the Negro, "My dear beloved brethren," should captivate these despised people. I attended a meeting at the large African Baptist Church, where the Rev. Moses D. Hodge, Doctor of Divinity, was to preach to the colored people against Catholicism. Dr. Hodge, though noted for his eloquence, and terribly in earnest, could not rise higher in his appeals to the blacks than to say men and women to them. The contrast was noticeable to all. After hearing Dr. Hodge through, I asked an intelligent colored man how he liked his sermon. His reply was, if Dr. Hodge is in earnest, Why don't he open his own church and invite us in and preach to us there? Before he can make any impression on us, he must go to the Catholic Church and learn the spirit of brotherly love." One Sunday, Bishop Keene said to the colored congregation, numbering 1,200, who had come to hear him, "There are distinctions in the business and in the social world, but there are no distinctions in the spiritual. A soul is a soul before God, may it be a black or a white man's. God is no respecter of persons. The Christian Church cannot afford to be. The people who would not let you learn to read before the war are the ones now that accuse me of trying to use you for political purposes. Now, my dear beloved brethren, when I attempt to tell you how to vote, you need not come to hear me preach any more." The blacks have been so badly treated in the past that kind words and social recognition will do much to win them in the future, for success will not depend so much upon their matter as upon their manner, not so much upon their faith as upon the more potent direct influence of their practice. In this the Catholics of the South have the inside track, for the prejudice of the Protestants seems in a fair way to let the Negro go anywhere except to heaven, if they have to go the same way. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23. Norfolk is the place above all others where the old Virginny never tire colored people of the olden time may be found in their purity. Here nearly everybody lives out of doors in the warm weather. This is not confined to the blacks. On the sidewalks, in front of the best hotels, under the awnings at store doors, on the door sills of private houses, and on the curbstones in the streets, may be seen people of all classes. But the blacks especially give the inside of the house a wide berth in the summer. I went to the market, for I always like to visit the markets on Saturday, for there you see life among the lowly as you see it nowhere else. Colored men and women have a respectable number of stalls in the Norfolk market, the management of which does them great credit. But the costermongers or street vendors are the men of music. Here's your nice vegetables, green corn, butter beans, taters, Irish taters, new, just been digged. Come and get 'em while they is fresh. Now's your time, squash, Californy squash, best in the world. Come and get 'em now. It'll be Sunday tomorrow, and I'll be gone to church. Big fat Mexican peas, marrer fat squash, Protestant squash, good Catholic vegetables of all kinds. Now's your time to get snap beans, okra, tomatoes, and taters going by. Don't be foolish virgins. Have the dinner ready when the master he comes home. Snap beans going by. Just then the vendor broke forth in a most musical voice. "Oh, Hannah, boil that cabbage down. Hannah, boil 'em down. And turn them buckwheats round and round. Hannah, boil 'em down. It's almost time to blow the horn. Hannah, boil 'em down. To call the boys that hoe the corn. Hannah, boil 'em down. Hannah, boil 'em down. The cabbage just pulled out the ground. Boil 'em in the pot, and make him smoking hot. Some like the cabbage made in kraut. Hannah, boil 'em down. They eat so much they get the gout. Hannah, boil 'em down. They chops 'em up and let them spoil. Hannah, boil 'em down. I'd rather have my cabbage boiled. Hannah, boil 'em down. Some say that 'possum's in the pan. Hannah, boil 'em down. Am the sweetest meat in all the land. Hannah, boil 'em down. But there's that old cabbage head. Hannah, boil 'em down. I'll prize it, children, till I's dead. Hannah, boil 'em down. This song, given in his inimitable manner, drew the women to the windows, and the crowd around the vegetable man in the street, and he soon disposed of the contents of his cart. Other vendors who toted their commodities about in baskets on their heads took advantage of the musical man's company to sell their own goods. A woman with some really fine strawberries put forth her claims in a very interesting song. The interest, however, centered more upon the manner than the matter. I live full miles out of town, I am going to glory. My strawberries are sweet and sound, I am going to glory. I fotch 'em full miles on my head, I am going to glory. My child is sick and husband dead, I am going to glory. Now's the time to get 'em cheap, I am going to glory. Eat 'em with your bread and meat, I am going to glory. Come, sinner, get down on your knees, I am going to glory. Eat these strawberries when you please, I am going to glory. Upon the whole, the colored man of Virginia is a very favorable physical specimen of his race, and he has peculiarly fine urbane manners. A stranger, judging from the surface of life here, would undoubtedly say that they were a happy, well-to-do people. Perhaps also he might say, "Ah, I see. The Negro is the same everywhere, a hewer of wood, a peddler of vegetables, a wearer of the waiter's white apron. Freedom has not altered his status." Such a judgment would be a very hasty one. Nations are not educated in 20 years. There are certain white men who naturally gravitate also to these positions, and we must remember that it is only the present generation of Negroes who have been able to appropriate any share of the nobler blessings of freedom. But the colored boys and girls of Virginia are today vastly different from what the colored boys and girls of 15 or 20 years ago were. The advancement and improvement is so great that it is that unreasonable to predict it from a very satisfactory future. The Negro population here are greatly in the majority, and formerly sent a member of their own color to the State Senate, but through bribery and ballot box stuffing, a white senator is now in Richmond. One Negro here at a late election sold his vote for a barrel of sugar. After he had voted and taken his sugar home, he found it to be a barrel of sand. I learned that his neighbors turned the laugh upon him, and made him treat the whole company, which cost him $5. I would not have it supposed, from what I have said about the general condition of the blacks in Virginia, that there are none of a higher grade. Far from it, for some of the best mechanics in the state are colored men. In Richmond and Petersburg they have stores and carry on considerable trade both with the whites and their own race. They are doing a great deal for education. Many send their sons and daughters north and west for better advantages, and they are building some of the finest churches in this state. The Second Baptist Church here pulled down a comparatively new and fine structure last year to replace it with a more splendid place of worship, simply because a rival church of the same denomination had surpassed them. I view the new edifice, and feel confident it will compare favorably with any church on the Back Bay, Boston. The new building will seat 3,000 persons, and will cost, exclusive of the ground, $100,000, all the brick and wood work of which is being done by colored men. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24. The education of the Negro in the South is the most important matter that we have to deal with at present, and one that will claim precedence of all other questions for many years to come. When, soon after the breaking out of the rebellion, schools for the freedmen were agitated in the North, and teachers dispatched from New England to go down to teach the poor contrabands, I went before the proper authorities in Boston, and asked that a place be given to one of our best educated colored young ladies, who wanted to devote herself to the education of her injured race, and the offer was rejected, upon the ground that the time for sending colored teachers had not come. This happened nearly 20 years ago. From that moment to the present, I have watched with painful interest the little progress made by colored men and women to become instructors of their own race in the Southern States. Under the spur of the excitement occasioned by the proclamation of freedom and the great need of schools for the blacks, thousands of dollars were contributed at the North, and agents sent to Great Britain, where generosity had no bounds. Money came in from all quarters, and some of the noblest white young women gave themselves up to the work of teaching the freedmen. During the first 3 or 4 years, this field for teachers was filled entirely by others than members of the colored race, and yet it was managed by the New England Freedmen's Association, made up in part by some of our best men and women. But many energetic, educated colored young women and men volunteered, and at their own expense went South and began private schools, and literally forced their way into the work. This was followed by a few appointments, which in every case proved that colored teachers for colored people was the great thing needed. Upon the foundations laid by these small schools, some of the most splendid educational institutions in the South have sprung up. Fisk, Howard, Atlanta, Hampton, Tennessee Central, Virginia Central, and Straight are some of the most prominent. These are all under the control and management of the whites, and are accordingly conducted upon the principle of whites for teachers and blacks for pupils. And yet each of the above institutions are indebted to the sympathy felt for the Negro, for their very existence. Some of these colleges give more encouragement to the Negro to become an instructor than others, but none, however, have risen high enough to measure the black man independent of his color. At Petersburg I found a large, fine building for public schools for colored youth. The principal, a white man, with 6 assistants, but not one colored teacher amongst them. Yet Petersburg has turned out some most excellent colored teachers, 2 of whom I met at Suffolk with small schools. These young ladies had graduated with honors at one of our best institutions, and yet could not obtain a position as teacher in a public school where the pupils were only their own race. At Nashville the school board was still more unjust, for they employed teachers who would not allow their colored scholars to recognize them on the streets, and for doing which the children were reprimanded, and the action of the teachers approved by the Board of Education. It is generally known that all the white teachers in our colored public schools feel themselves above their work, and the fewest number have any communication whatever with their pupils outside the schoolroom. Upon receiving their appointments and taking charge of their schools, some of them have been known to announce to their pupils that under no circumstances were they to recognize or speak to them on the streets. It is very evident that these people have no heart in the work they are doing, and simply from day to day go through the mechanical form of teaching our children for the pittance they receive as a salary. While teachers who have no interest in the children they instruct except for the salary they get are employed in the public schools and in the freedmen's colleges, hundreds of colored men and women who are able to stand the most rigid examination are idle, or occupying places far beneath what they deserve. It is expected that the public schools will, to a greater or less extent, be governed by the political predilections of the parties in power. But we ought to look for better things from Fisk, Hampton, Howard, Atlanta, Tennessee Central, and Virginia Central, whose walls sprung up by money raised from appeals made for Negro education. There are, however, other educational institutions of which I have not made mention, and which deserve the patronage of the benevolent everywhere. These are Wilberforce, Berea, Payne Institute in South Carolina, Waco College in Texas, and Storer College at Harper's Ferry. Wilberforce is well known, and is doing a grand work. It has turned out some of the best of our scholars, men whose labours for the elevation of their race cannot be too highly commended. Storer College, at Harper's Ferry, looks down upon the ruins of John Brown's fort. In the ages to come, Harper's Ferry will be sought out by the traveller from other lands. Here at the confluence of the Potomac and the Shenandoah rivers, on a point just opposite the gap through which the united streams pass the Blue Ridge on their course toward the ocean, stands the romantic town, and a little above it, on a beautiful eminence, is Storer, an institution, and of whose officers I cannot speak too highly. I witnessed with intense interest the earnest efforts of these good men and women in their glorious work of the elevation of my race. And while the benevolent of the North are giving of their abundance, I would earnestly beg them not to forget Storer College at Harper's Ferry. The other two, of which I have made mention, are less known, but their students are numerous and well trained. Both these schools are in the South, and both are owned and managed by colored men, free from the supposed necessity of having white men to do their thinking, and therein ought to receive the special countenance of all who believe in giving the colored people a chance to paddle their own canoe. I failed, however, to find schools for another part of our people, which appear to be much needed. For many years in the olden time, the South was noted for its beautiful quadroon women. Bottles of ink and reams of paper have been used to portray the finely cut and well moulded features, the silken curls, the dark and brilliant eyes, the splendid forms, the fascinating smiles and accomplished manners of these impassioned and voluptuous daughters of the two races, the unlawful product of the crime of human bondage. When we take into consideration the fact that no safeguard was ever thrown around virtue, and no inducement held out to slave women to be pure and chaste, we will not be surprised when told that immorality pervaded the domestic circle in the cities and towns of the South to an extent unknown in the Northern States. Many a planter's wife has dragged out a miserable existence with an aching heart at seeing her place in the husband's affections usurped by the unadorned beauty and captivating smiles of her waiting maid. Indeed, the greater portion of the colored women in the days of slavery had no greater aspiration than that of becoming the finely dressed mistress of some white man. Although freedom has brought about a new order of things, and our colored women are making rapid strides to rise above the dark scenes of the past, yet the want of protection to our people since the old time whites have regained power, places a large number of the colored young women of the cities and towns at the mercy of bad colored men, or worse, white men. To save these from destruction, institutions ought to be established in every large city. Mrs. Julia G. Thomas, a very worthy lady, deeply interested in the welfare of her sex, has a small institution for orphans and friendless girls, where they will have a home, schooling, and business training to fit them to enter life with a prospect of success. Mrs. Thomas's address is 190 High Street, Nashville, Tennessee. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25. Among the causes of that dissatisfaction of the colored people in the South, which has produced the exodus therefrom, there is one that lies beneath the surface, and is concealed from even an astute observer, if he is a stranger to that section. This cause consists in certain legislative enactments that have been passed in most of the cotton states, ostensibly for the purposes, but really for the purpose of establishing in those states a system of peonage similar to, if not worse than, that which prevails in Mexico. This is the object of a statute passed by the legislature of Mississippi in March, 1878. The title of the act, whether intentionally so or not, is certainly misleading. It is entitled "An Act to Reduce the Judiciary Expenses of the State." But how it can possibly have that effect is beyond human wisdom to perceive. It, however, does operate, and is used in such a way as to enslave a large number of Negroes, who have not even been convicted of the slightest offense against the laws. The act provides that all persons convicted and committed to the jail of the county, except those committed to jail for contempt of court, and except those sentenced to imprisonment in the penitentiary, shall be delivered to a contractor, to be by him kept and worked under the provisions of this act. And all persons committed to jail, except those not entitled to bail, may also, with their consent, be committed to said contractor, and worked under this act before conviction. But Section 5 of the Act provides ample and cogent machinery to produce the necessary consent on the part of the not yet convicted prisoner to work for the contractor. In that section it is provided that if any person committed to jail for an offense that is bailable shall not consent to be committed to the safekeeping and custody of said contractor, and to work for the same under this act, the prisoner shall be entitled to receive only 6 ounces of bacon, or 10 ounces of beef, and 1 pound of bread and water. This section also provides that any prisoner not consenting to work before his conviction for the contractor, and that too without compensation, if said prisoner shall afterward be convicted, he shall nevertheless work under said contractor a sufficient term to pay all cost of prosecution, including the regular jail fees for keeping and feeding him. The charge for feeding him, upon the meagre bill of fare above stated, is 20 cents a day. Now, it cannot be denied that the use made of this law is to deprive the Negro of his natural right to choose his own employer. And in the following manner. Let us suppose a case, and such cases are constantly occurring. A is a cotton planter, owns 3,000 or 4,000 acres of land, and has 40, 50, or 100 Negro families on his plantation. At the expiration of the year, a Negro proposes to leave the plantation of A, and try to better his condition by making a more advantageous bargain with B or C for another year. If A can prevent the Negro from leaving him in no other way, this statute puts full power in his hands. A trumps up some petty charge against the Negro, threatens to have him arrested and committed to jail. The Negro knows how little it will take to commit him to jail, and that then he must half starve on a pound of bread and water and 6 ounces of bacon a day, or work for the contractor for nothing until he can be tried, and when tried he must run the risk of conviction, which is not slight, though he may be ever so innocent. Avarice, unscrupulous avarice, is pursuing him, and with little power to resist, there being no healthy public sentiment in favor of fair play to encourage him, he yields, and becomes the peon of his oppressor. I found the whipping post in full operation in Virginia, and heard of its being enforced in other states. I inquired of a black man what he thought of the revival of that mode of punishment. He replied, "Well, sir, I don't care for it, 'cause they treats us all alike. They whips whites at the post just as they do the blacks, and that's what I calls equality before the law." A friend of mine, meeting a man who was leaving Arkansas on account of the revival of her old slave laws, the following conversation occurred, showing that the oppression of the blacks extends to all the states South. "You come from Arkansas, I understand." "Yes." "What wages do you generally get for your work?" "Since about '68 we've been getting about 2 bits a day. That's 20 cents. Then there are some people that work by the month, and at the end of the month they either put off or cheated out of their money entirely. Property and goods are worth nothing to a black man there. He can't get his price for them. He gets just what the white man chooses to give him. Some people who raise from 10 to 15 bales of cotton sometimes have hardly enough to cover their body and feet. This goes on while the white man gets the price he asks for his goods. This is unfair, and as long as we pay taxes, we want justice, right, and equality before the people." What taxes do you pay? A man that owns a house and lot has to pay about $26 a year. And if he has a mule worth about $150, they tax him $2.50 extra. If they see you have money, say you made $3,000, you'd soon see some bill about taxes, land lease, and the other coming in for about $2,000 of it. They charge a black man $13 where they would only charge a white man $1 or $2. Now there's a man, pointing to a portly old fellow, who had to run away from his house, farm and all. It is for this we leave Arkansas. We want freedom, and I say, give me liberty or give me death. We took up arms and fought for our country, so we ought to have our rights. How about the schooling you receive? We can't vote. Still, we have to pay taxes to support schools for the others. I got my education in New Orleans and paid for it too. I have 6 children, and though I pay taxes, not one of them has any schooling from the public schools. The taxes and rent are so heavy that the children have to work when they are as young as 10 years. That's the way it is down there. Did you have any teachers from the North? There were some teachers from the North who come down there, but they were run out. They were paid so badly and treated so mean that they had to go. What county did you live in? Phillips County. How many schools were in that county? About 5. When do they open? About once every 2 years and keep open for 2 or 3 weeks. And then they have a certain kind of book for the children. Those that have dogs, cats, hogs, cows, horses, and all sorts of animals in them. They keep the children in these and never let them get out of them. Have you any colleges in the state for colored men? No, they haven't got any colleges and don't allow any. The other day I asked a Republican how was it that so many thousands of dollars were taken for colleges and we didn't get any good of it. He said the bill didn't pass somehow, and now I guess those fellas spent all that money. As a general thing, then, the people are very ignorant? Yes, sir. The colored man that's got education is like some people that's got religion. He hides it under a bushel. If he didn't, and stood up for his rights as a citizen, he would soon become the game of some of the Ku Klux Clubs. Having succeeded in getting possession of power in the South, and driving the black voters from the polls at elections, and also having them counted in national representation, the ex-rebels will soon have a power which they never before enjoyed. Had the slaveholders in 1860 possessed the right of representing their slaves fully instead of partly in Congress and in the Electoral College, they would have ruled this country indefinitely in the interest of slavery. It was supposed that by the result of the war, freedom profited, and the slaveholding class lost power forever. But the very act which conferred the full right of representation upon the 3 million freedmen by the help of the policy has placed an instrument in the hands of the rebel conspirators which they will use to pervert and defeat the objects of the constitutional amendments. Through this policy, the 35 additional electoral votes given to the freedmen have been turned over to the Democratic Party. Aye, more than that, they have been turned over to the ex-rebels, who will use them in the cause of oppression scarcely second in hatefulness to that of chattel slavery. In a contest with the solid South, therefore, the party of freedom and justice will have greater odds to overcome than it did in 1860, and the Southern oligarchs hold a position which is well nigh impregnable for whatever purpose they choose to use it. Of the large number of massacres perpetrated upon the blacks in the South since the ex-rebels have come into power, I give one instance which will show the inhumanity of the whites. This outrage occurred in Gibson County, Tennessee. The report was first circulated that the blacks in great numbers were armed, and were going to commit murder upon the whites. This created the excitement that it was intended to, and the whites, in large bodies, armed to the teeth, went through Gibson and adjoining counties, disarming the blacks, taking from them their only means of defense, and arresting all objectionable blacks that they could find, taking them to Trenton and putting them in jail. The following account of the wanton massacre is from the Memphis Appeal. About 400 armed, disguised, mounted men entered this town at 2 o'clock this morning, proceeded to the jail, and demanded the keys of the jailer, Mr. Alexander. He refused to give up the keys. Sheriff Williams, hearing the noise, awoke and went to the jail, and refused to surrender the keys to the maskers, telling them that he did not have the keys. They cocked their pistols, and he refused again to give them the keys, whereupon the captain of the company ordered the masked men to draw their pistols and cock them, swearing they would have the keys or shoot the jailer. The jailer dared them to shoot, and said they were too cowardly to shoot. They failed to do this. Then they threatened to tear down the jail or get the prisoners. The jailer told them that rather than they should tear down the jail, he would give them the keys if they would go with him to his office. The jailer did this because he saw that the men were determined to break through. They were all disguised. Then they came, says the sheriff, and got the keys from my office, and giving 3 or 4 yells, went to the jail, unlocked it, took out the 16 negroes who had been brought here from Pickettsville, Gibson, and tying their hands, escorted them away. They proceeded on the Huntingdon road without saying a word, and in 15 minutes I heard shots. In company with several citizens, I proceeded down the road in the direction taken by the men and prisoners, and just beyond the river bridge, half a mile from town, I found 4 negroes dead, on the ground, their bodies riddled with bullets, and 2 wounded. We saw no masked men. 10 negroes yet remain unaccounted for. Leaving the dead bodies where we found them, we brought the 2 wounded negroes to town, and summoned medical aid. Justice J. M. Caldwell held an inquest on the bodies, the verdict being in accordance with the facts that death resulted from shots inflicted by guns in the hands of unknown parties. The inquest was held about 8 o'clock this morning. These are all the facts relative to the shooting I can give you. I did my duty to prevent the rescue of the negroes, but found it useless to oppose the men, one of whom said there were 400 in the band. Night before last, the guard that brought the prisoners from Pickettsville remained. No fears or intimations of the attempted rescue were then heard of or feared. This morning, learning that 400 or 500 armed negroes on the Jackson road were marching into town to burn the buildings and kill the people, the citizens immediately organized, armed, and prepared for active defense, and went out to meet the negroes. Scouted the whole country around, but found no armed negroes. The citizens throughout the country commenced coming into town by hundreds. Men came from Union City, Kenton, Troy, Rutherford, Dyer Station, Skullbone, and the whole country, but found no need for their services. The 2 wounded negroes will die. The bodies of the 10 other negroes taken from the jail were found in the river bottom about a mile from town. We blush for our state, and with the shame of the bloody murder, the disgraceful defiance of law, of order, and of decency full upon us, are at a loss for language with which to characterize a deed that, if the work of Comanches or Modocs, would arouse every man in the Union for a speedy vengeance on the perpetrators. Today we must hold up to merited reprobation and condemnation the armed men who besieged the Trenton jail, and wantonly as wickedly, without anything like justification, took thence the unarmed negroes there awaiting trial by the courts, and brutally shot them to death. And, too, with a show of barbarity altogether as unnecessary as the massacre was unjustifiable. To say that we are not in any county in the state strong enough to enforce the law is to pronounce a libel upon the whole Commonwealth. We are as 1,000 to 1 in moral and physical force to the negro. We are in possession of the state, of all the machinery of government, and at a time more momentous than any we ever hope to see again, have proved our capacity to sustain the law's executive officers and maintain the laws. Why, then, should we now, in time of profound peace, subvert the law and defy its administrators? Why should we put the government of our own selection under our feet, and defy and set at naught the men whom we have elected to enforce the laws? And this ruthlessly and savagely, without any of the forms even that usually attend on the administration of the wild behests of Judge Lynch. And all without color of extenuation. For no sane man who has regard for the truth will pretend to say that because the unfortunate negroes were arrested as the ringleaders of a threatening and armed band that had fired upon 2 white men, they were, therefore, worthy of death, and without the forms of law, in a state controlled and governed by law-abiding men. No one was ever punished, or even an attempt made to ferret out the perpetrators of this foul murder. And the infliction of the death punishment by lynch law on colored persons for the slightest offense proves that there is really no abatement in this hideous race prejudice that prevails throughout the South. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26. Years ago, when the natural capabilities of the races were more under discussion than now, the Negro was always made to appear to greater disadvantage than the rest of mankind. The public mind is not yet free from this false theory, nor has the colored man done much of late years to change this opinion. Long years of training of any people to a particular calling seems to fit them for that vocation more than for any other. Thus the Jews, inured to centuries of money-lending and pawnbroking, they as a race stick to it as if they were created for that business alone. The training of the Arabs for long excursions through wild deserts makes them the master roamers of the world. The gypsies, brought up to camping out and trading in horses, send forth the idea that they were born for it. The black man's position as a servant for many generations has not only made the other races believe that is his legitimate sphere, but he himself feels more at home in a white apron and a towel on his arm than with a quill behind his ear and a ledger before him. That a colored man takes to the dining room and the kitchen as a duck does to water only proves that, like other races, his education has entered into his blood. This is not theory, this is not poetry, but stern truth. Our people prefer to be servants. This may be to some extent owing to the fact that the organ of alimentiveness is more prominently formed in the Negro's make-up than in that of almost any other people. During several trips in the cars between Nashville and Columbia, I noticed that the boy who sold newspapers and supplied the passengers with fruit had a basket filled with candy and cakes. The first time I was on his car, he offered me the cakes, which I declined, but bought a paper. Watching him, I observed that when colored persons entered the car, he would offer them the cakes, which they seldom failed to purchase. One day, as I took from him a newspaper, I inquired of him why he always offered cakes to the colored passengers. His reply was, "Oh, they always buy something to eat." "Do they purchase more cakes than white people?" "Yes," was the response. "Why do they buy your cakes and candy?" I asked. "Well, sir, the colored people seem always to be hungry. Never see anything like it. They don't buy papers, but they are always eating." Just then we stopped at Franklin, and 3 colored passengers came in. "Now," continued the cake boy, "you'll see how they'll take the cakes," and he started for them, but had to pass their seats to shut the door that had been left open. In going by, one of the men, impatient to get a cake, called, Here, come here with your cakes." The peddler looked at me and laughed. He sold each one a cake, and yet it was not 10 o'clock in the morning. Not long since, in Massachusetts, I succeeded in getting a young man pardoned from our state prison, where he had been confined for more than 10 years, and where he had learned a good trade. I had already secured him a situation where he was to receive $3 per day to commence with a prospect of an advance of wages. As we were going to his boarding place, and after I had spent some time in advising him to turn over a new leaf and to try and elevate himself, we passed one of our best hotels. My ward at once stopped, began snuffing as if he smelt a mice. I looked at him, watched his countenance as it lighted up, and his eyes sparkled. I inquired what was the matter. With a radiant smile he replied, "I smell good wittles. What place is that?" "It is the Revere House," I said. "Wonder if I could get a place to wait on table there?" he asked. I thought it a sorry comment on my efforts to instill into him some self-respect. This young man had learned the shoemaking trade, and at a Mackey machine I understood that he could earn from $3.50 to $5 per day. A dozen years ago, 2 colored young men commenced the manufacture of one of the necessary commodities of the day. After running the establishment some 6 or 8 months successfully, they sold out to white men, who now employ more than 100 hands. Both of the colored men are at their legitimate callings. One is a waiter in a private house, the other is a porter on a sleeping car. The failure of these young men to carry on a manufacturing business was mainly owing to a want of training, in a business point of view. No man is fit for a profession or a trade unless he has learned it. Extravagance in dress is a great and growing evil with our people. I am acquainted with a lady in Boston who wears a silk dress costing $130. She lives in 2 rooms, and her husband is a hairdresser. Since the close of the war, a large number of freedmen settled in Massachusetts, where they became servants, the most of them. These people surpass in dress the wealthiest merchants of the city. A young man, now a servant in a private house, sports a $60 overcoat while he works for $20 per month. A woman who cooks for $5 per week in Arlington Street swings along every Sunday in a $100 silk dress and a $30 hat. She cannot read or write. Go to our churches on the Sabbath and see the silk, the satin, the velvet, and the costly feathers, and talk with the uneducated wearers, and you will see at once the main hindrance to self-elevation. To elevate ourselves and our children, we must cultivate self-denial, repress our appetites for luxuries, and be content with clothing ourselves in garments becoming our means and our incomes. The adaptation and the deep inculcation of the principles of total abstinence from all intoxicants. The latter is a prerequisite for success in all the relations of life. Emerging from the influence of oppression, taught from early experience to have no confidence in the whites, we have little or none in our own race, or even in ourselves. We need more self-reliance, more confidence in the ability of our own people, more manly independence, a higher standard of moral, social, and literary culture. Indeed, we need a union of effort to remove the dark shadow of ignorance that now covers the land. While the barriers of prejudice keep us morally and socially from educated white society, we must make a strong effort to raise ourselves from the common level where emancipation and the new order of things found us. We possess the elements of successful development, but we need live men and women to make this development. The last great struggle for our rights, the battle for our own civilization, is entirely with ourselves, and the problem is to be solved by us. We must use our spare time, day and night, to educate ourselves. Let us have night schools for the adults, and not be ashamed to attend them. Encourage our own literary men and women. Subscribe for, and be sure and pay for, papers published by colored men. Don't stop to inquire if the paper will live, but encourage it and make it live. With the exception of a few benevolent societies, we are separated as far from each other as the East is from the West. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27. Union is strength has long since passed into a proverb. The colored people of the South should at once form associations, combine and make them strong, and live up to them by all hazards. All civilized races have risen by means of combination and cooperation. The Irishman, the German, the Frenchman, all come to this country poor, and they stay here but a short time before you see them succeeding in some branch of business. This success is not the result of individual effort. It is the result of combination and cooperation. Whatever an Irishman has to spend, he puts in the till of one of his own countrymen, and that accounts for Irish success. A German succeeds in this country because all his fellow countrymen patronize him in whatever business he engages. A German will put himself to inconvenience and go miles out of his way to spend money with one of his own race and nationality. With all his fickleness, the Frenchman never forgets to find out and patronize one of his own people. Italians flock together and stand by each other, right or wrong. The Chinese are clannish and stick by one another. The Caucasian race is the foremost in the world in everything that pertains to advanced civilization, simply owing to the fact that an Englishman never passes the door of a countryman to patronize another race. And a Yankee is a Yankee all the days of his life, and will never desert his colors. But where is the Negro? A gentlemanly and well-informed colored man came to me a few days since, wishing to impart to me some important information, and he commenced by saying, "Now, Doctor, what I am going to tell you, you may rely on its being true, because I got it from a white man. No nigger told me this." On Duke Street, in Alexandria, Virginia, resides an Irishman who began business in that place a dozen years ago, with 2 jugs, one filled with whiskey, the other with molasses, a little pork, some vegetables, sugar, and salt. On the opposite side of the street was our good friend Mr. A. S. Perpiner. The latter had a respectable provision store, minus the whiskey. Colored people inhabited the greater part of the street. Did they patronize their own countrymen? Not a bit of it. The Irishman's business increased rapidly. He soon enlarged his premises, adding wood and coal to his saleables. Perpiner did the same, but the blacks passed by and went over on the other side, gave their patronage to the son of Aaron, who now has houses to let, but he will not rent them to colored tenants. The Jews, though scattered throughout the world, are still Jews. Their race and their religion they have maintained in all countries and all ages. They never forsake each other. If they fall out over some trade, they make up in time to combine against the rest of mankind. Shylock says, "I will buy with you, sell with you, talk with you, walk with you, and so following, but I will not eat with you, drink with you, nor pray with you." Thus the Jew, with all his love of money, will not throw off his religion to satisfy others, and for this we honor him. It is the misfortune of our race that the impression prevails that one nigger is as good as another. Now this is a great error. There are colored men in this country as far ahead of others of their own race as Webster and Sumner were superior to the average white man. Then again, we have no confidence in each other. We consider the goods from the store of a white man necessarily better than can be purchased from a colored man. No man ever succeeded who lacked confidence in himself. No race ever did or ever will prosper or make a respectable history which has no confidence in its own nationality. Those who do not appreciate their own people will not be appreciated by other people. If a white man will pat a colored man on the shoulder, bow to him, and call him Mister, he will go a mile out of his way to patronize him, if in doing so he passes a first-class dealer of his own race. I asked a colored man in Columbia if he patronized Mr. Frierson. He said no. I inquired why. "He never invited me to his house in his life," was the reply. "Does the white man you deal with invite you?" "No." "Then why do you expect Mr. Frierson to do it?" "Oh, he's a nigger, and I look for more from him than I do from a white man." So it is clear that this is the result of jealousy. The recent case of the ill treatment of Cadet Whittaker at West Point shows most clearly the unsuspecting character of the Negro when dealing with whites. Although Whittaker had been repeatedly warned that an attack was to be made upon him, and especially told to look out for the assault the very night that the crime was committed, he laid down with his room door unfastened, went off into a sound sleep, with no weapon or means of defense near him. This was, for all the world, like a Negro. A Yankee would have had a revolver with every chamber loaded. An Irishman would have slept with one eye open, and a stout shillelagh in his right hand, and in all probability somebody would have had a nice funeral after the attack. But that want of courage and energy so characteristic of the race permitted one of the foulest crimes to be perpetrated which has come to light for years. But the most disgraceful part in this whole transaction lies with the court of investigation now being conducted at West Point under the supervision of United States officials. The unfeeling and unruly cadets that outraged Whittaker no doubt laid a deep plan to cover up their tracks, and this was to make it appear that their victim had inflicted upon himself his own injuries. And acting upon this theory, one of the young scamps, who had no doubt been rehearsing for the occasion, volunteered to show the court how the Negro could have practiced the imposition. And strange to say, these sage investigators sat quietly and looked on while the young ruffian laid down upon the floor, tied himself, and explained how the thing was done. If the victim had been a white man and his persecutors black, does anyone believe for a moment that such a theory would have been listened to? Generations of oppression have done their work too thoroughly to have its traces wiped away in a dozen years. The race must be educated out of the ignorance in which it at present dwells, and lifted to a level with other races. Colored lawyers, doctors, artisans, and mechanics starve for patronage, while the Negro is begging the white man to do his work. Combinations have made other races what they are today. The great achievements of scientific men could not have been made practical by individual effort. The great works of genius could never have benefited the world had those who composed them been mean and selfish. All great and useful enterprises have succeeded through the influence and energy of numbers. I would not have it thought that all colored men are to be bought by the white man's smiles, or to be frightened by intimidation. Far from it. In all the Southern States we have some of the noblest specimens of mankind, men of genius, refinement, courage, and liberality, ready to do and to die for the race. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28. Advice upon the formation of literary associations and total abstinence from all intoxications is needed, and I will give it to you in this chapter. The time for colored men and women to organize for self-improvement has arrived. Moral, social, and intellectual development should be the main attainment of the Negro race. Colored people have so long been in the habit of aping the whites, and often not the better class either, that I fear this characteristic in them more than anything else. A large percentage of them being waiters, they see a great deal of drinking in white society of the upper 10. Don't follow their bad example. Take warning by their degradation. During the year 1879, Boston sent 400 drunken women to the Sherborne prison, while 2 private asylums are full, many of them from Boston's first families. Therefore, I beseech you to never allow the intoxicant to enter your circles. It is bad enough for men to lapse into habits of drunkenness. A drunken husband, a drunken father, only those patient, heartbroken, shamefaced wives and children on whom this great cross of suffering is laid can estimate the misery which it brings. But a drunken girl, a drunken wife, a drunken mother, is there for woman a deeper depth? Home made hideous, children disgraced, neglected, and maltreated. Remember that all this comes from the first glass. The wine may be pleasant to the taste, and may for the time being furnish happiness, but it must never be forgotten that whatever degree of exhilaration may be produced in a healthy person by the use of wine, it will most certainly be succeeded by a degree of nervous depression proportioned to the amount of previous excitement. Hence the immoderate use of wine, or its habitual indulgence, debilitates the brain and nervous system, paralyzes the intellectual powers, impairs the functions of the stomach, produces a perverted appetite for a renewal of the deleterious beverage, or a morbid imagination, which destroys man's usefulness. The next important need with our people is the cultivation of habits of business. We have been so long a dependent race, so long looking to the white as our leaders and being content with doing the drudgery of life, that most who commence business for themselves are likely to fail, because of want of a knowledge of what we undertake. As the education of a large percentage of the colored people is of a fragmentary character, having been gained by little and little here and there, and must necessarily be limited to a certain degree, we should use our spare hours in study and form associations for moral, social, and literary culture. We must aim to enlighten ourselves and to influence others to higher associations. Our work lies primarily with the inward culture, at the springs and sources of individual life and character, seeking everywhere to encourage and assist to the fullest emancipation of the human mind from ignorance, inviting the largest liberty of thought, and the utmost possible exaltation of life into approximation to the loftier standard of cultivated character. Feeling that the literature of our age is the reflection of the existing manners and modes of thought, etherealized and refined in the alembic genius, we should give our principal encouragement to literature, bringing before our associations the importance of original essays, selected readings, and the cultivation of the musical talent. If we need any proof of the good that would accrue from such cultivation, we have only to look back and see the wonderful influence of Homer over the Greeks, of Virgil and Horace over the Romans, of Dante and Ariosto over the Italians, of Goethe and Schiller over the Germans, of Racine and Voltaire over the French, of Shakespeare and Milton over the English. The imaginative powers of these men, wrought into verse or prose, have been the theme of the king in his palace, the lover in his dreamy moods, the farmer in the harvest field, the mechanic in the workshop, the sailor on the high seas, and the prisoner in his gloomy cell. Indeed, authors possess the most gifted and fertile minds who combine all the graces of style with rare, fascinating powers of language, eloquence, wit, humor, pathos, genius, and learning. And to draw knowledge from such sources should be one of the highest aims of man. The better elements of society can only be brought together by organizing societies and clubs. The cultivation of the mind is the superstructure of the moral, social, and religious character, which will follow us into our everyday life, and make us what God intended us to be, the noblest instruments of his creative power. Our efforts should be to imbue our minds with broader and better views of science, literature, and a nobleness of spirit that ignores petty aims of patriotism, glory, or mere personal aggrandizement. It is said, "Never a shadow falls that does not leave a permanent impress of its image, a monument of its passing presence." Every character is modified by association. Words, the image of the ideas, are more impressive than shadows. Actions, embodied thoughts, more enduring than aught material. Believing these truths, then, I say, for every thought expressed, ennobling in its tendency and elevating to Christian dignity and manly honor, God will reward us. Permanent success depends upon intrinsic worth. The best way to have a public character is to have a private one. The great struggle for our elevation is now with ourselves. We may talk of Hannibal, Euclid, Phyllis Wheatley, Benjamin Banneker, and Toussaint L'Ouverture, but the world will ask us for our men and women of the day. We cannot live upon the past. We must hew out a reputation that will stand the test, one that we have a legitimate right to. To do this we must imitate the best examples set us by the cultivated whites, and by so doing we will teach them that they can claim no superiority on account of race. The efforts made by oppressed nations or communities to throw off their chains entitles them to, and gains for them, the respect of mankind. This the blacks never made, or what they did was so feeble as scarcely to call for comment. The planning of Denmark Vesey for an insurrection in South Carolina was noble, and deserved a better fate, but he was betrayed by the race that he was attempting to serve. Nat Turner's strike for liberty was the outburst of feelings of an insane man, made so by slavery. True, the Negro did good service at the battles of Wagner, Honey Hill, Port Hudson, Milliken's Bend, Poison Springs, Olustee, and Petersburg. Yet it would have been far better if they had commenced earlier, or had been under leaders of their own color. The St. Domingo Revolution brought forth men of courage, but the subsequent course of the people as a government reflects little or no honor on the race. They have floated about like a ship without a rudder ever since the expulsion of Rochambeau. The fact is, the world likes to see the exhibition of pluck on the part of an oppressed people, even though they fail in their object. It is these outbursts of the love of liberty that gains respect and sympathy for the enslaved. Therefore, I bid God speed to the men and women of the South in their effort to break the long spell of lethargy that hangs over the race. Don't be too rash in starting, but prepare to go. And don't stand upon the order of going, but go. By common right, the South is the Negro's home. Born and raised there, he cleared up the lands, built the cities, fed and clothed the whites, nursed their children, earned the money to educate their sons and daughters. By the Negro's labor, churches were built and clergymen paid. For 200 years the Southern whites lived a lazy life at the expense of the Negro's liberty. When the rebellion came, the blacks, trusted and true to the last, protected the families and homes of white men while they were away fighting the government. The South is the black man's home, yet if he cannot be protected in his rights, he should leave. Where white men of liberal views can get no protection, the colored man must not look for it. Follow the example of other oppressed races. Strike out for new territory. If suffering is the result, let it come. Others have suffered before you. Look at the Irish, Germans, French, Italians, and other races who have come to this country, gone to the West, and are now enjoying the blessings of liberty and plenty, while the Negro is discussing the question of whether he should leave the South or not, simply because he was born there. While they are thus debating the subject, their old oppressors, seeing that the Negro has touched the right chord, forbid his leaving the country. Georgia has made it a penal offense to invite the blacks to emigrate, and one Negro is already in prison for wishing to better the condition of his fellows. This is the same spirit that induced the people of that state to offer a reward of $5,000 in 1835 for the head of Garrison. No people has borne oppression like the Negro, and no race has been so much imposed upon. Go to his own land, ask the Dutch Boer whence comes his contempt and inward dislike to the Negro, the Hottentot, and Kaffir. Ask him for his warrant to reduce these unhappy races to slavery. He will point to the firearms suspended over the mantelpiece. There is my right. Want of independence is the colored man's greatest fault. In the present condition of the Southern States, with the lands in the hands of a shoddy, ignorant, superstitious, rebellious, and Negro-hating population, the blacks cannot be independent. Then emigrate to get away from the surroundings that keep you down where you are. All cannot go, even if it were desirable, but those who remain will have a better opportunity. The planters will then have to pursue a different policy. The right of the Negroes to make the best terms they can will have to be recognized, and what was before presumption that called for repression will now be tolerated as among the privileges of freedom. The ability of the Negroes to change their location will also turn public sentiment against bulldozing. 200 years have demonstrated the fact that the Negro is the manual laborer of that section, and without him agriculture will be at a standstill. The Negro will for pay perform any service under heaven, no matter how repulsive or full of hardship. He will sing his old plantation melodies and walk about the cotton fields in July and August, when the toughest white man seeks an awning. Heat is his element. He fears no malaria in the rice swamps, where a white man's life is not worth 6 pence. Then I say, leave the South and starve the whites into a realization of justice and common sense. Remember that tyrants never relinquish their grasp upon their victims until they are forced to. Whether the blacks emigrate or not, I say to them, keep away from the cities and towns. Go into the country. Go to work on farms. If you stop in the city, get a profession or a trade, but keep in mind that a good trade is better than a poor profession. In Boston there are a large number of colored professionals, especially in the law, and a majority of whom are better fitted for farm service, mechanical branches, or for driving an ash cart. Persons should not select professions for the name of being a professional, nor because they think they will lead an easy life. An honorable, lucrative, and faithfully earned professional reputation is a career of honesty, patience, sobriety, toil, and Christian zeal. No drone can fill such a position. Select the profession or trade that your education, inclination, strength of mind and body will support, and then give your time to the work that you have undertaken, and work, work. Once more, I say to those who cannot get remunerative employment at the South, emigrate. Some say, stay and fight it out. Contend for your rights. Don't let the old rebels drive you away. The country is as much yours as theirs. That kind of talk will do very well for men who have comfortable homes out of the South, and law to protect them. But for the Negro with no home, no food, no work, the landowner offering him conditions whereby he can do but little better than starve, such talk is nonsense. Fight out what? Hunger? Poverty? Cold? Starvation? Black men, emigrate. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29. In America, the Negro stands alone as a race. He is without mate or fellow in the great family of man. Whatever progress he makes, it must be mainly by his own efforts. This is an unfortunate fact, and for which there seems to be no remedy. All history demonstrates the truth that amalgamation is the great civilizer of the races of men. Wherever a race, clan, or community have kept themselves together, prohibiting by law, usage, or common consent, intermarriage with others, they have made little or no progress. The Jews, a distinct and isolated people, are good only at driving a bargain and getting rich. The Gypsies commence and stop with trading horses. The Irish, in their own country, are dull. The Coptic race form but a handful of what they were, those builders, unequaled in ancient or modern times. What has become of them? Where are the Romans? What races have they destroyed? What races have they supplanted? For 14 centuries they lorded it over the semi-civilized world, and now they are of no more note than the ancient Scythians, or Mongols, Copts, or Tartars. An unamalgamated, inactive people will decline. Thus it was with the Mexicans when Cortes marched on Mexico, and the Peruvians when Pizarro marched on Peru. The Britons were a dull, lethargic people before their country was invaded, and the hot, romantic blood of Julius Caesar and William of Normandy coursed through their veins. Caractacus, king of the Britons, was captured and sent to Rome in chains. Still later, Hengist and Horsa, the Saxon generals, imposed the most humiliating conditions upon the Britons, to which they were compelled to submit. Then came William of Normandy, defeated Harold of Hastings, and the blood of the most renowned land pirates and sea robbers that ever disgraced humanity mixed with the Briton and Saxon, and gave to the world the Anglo-Saxon race, with its physical ability, strong mind, brave and enterprising spirit. And yet all that this race is, it owes to its mixed blood. Civilization, or the social condition of man, is the result and test of the qualities of every race. The benefit of this blood mixture the Negro is never to enjoy on this continent. In the South, where he is raised, in the North, East, or West, it is all the same. No new blood is to be infused into his sluggish veins. His only hope is education, professions, trades, and copying the best examples, no matter from what source they come. This antipathy to amalgamation with the Negro has shown itself in all of the states. Most of the Northern and Eastern state legislatures have passed upon this question years ago. Since the coming in of the present year, Rhode Island's Senate refused to repeal the old law forbidding the intermarriage of whites and blacks. Thus the colored man is left to paddle his own canoe alone. Where there is no law against the mixture of the two races, there is a public sentiment which is often stronger than law itself. Even the wild blood of the Red Indian refuses to mingle with the sluggish blood of the Negro. This is no light matter, for race hate, prejudice, and common malice all die away before the melting power of amalgamation. The beauty of the half-breeds of the South, the result of the crime of slavery, have long claimed the attention of writers, and why not a lawful mixture? And then this might help in making a race far more lovely and fair, darker a little than white people are, stronger and nobler and better in form, hearts more voluptuous, kinder, and warm. Bosoms of beauty that heave with a pride nature had ever to white folks denied. Immigration to other states, where the blacks will come in contact with educated and enterprising whites, will do them much good. This benefit by commercial intercourse is seen in the 4,000 colored people who have come to Boston, where most of them are employed as servants. They are sought after as the best domestics in the city. Some of these people, who were in slavery before the war, are now engaged in mercantile pursuits, doing good business, and showing what contact will do. Many of them rank with the ablest whites in the same trades. Indeed, the various callings are well represented by Southern men, showing plainly the need of immigration. Although the colored man has been sadly at fault in not vindicating his right to liberty, he has, it is true, shown ability in other fields. Benjamin Banneker, a Negro of Maryland who lived 100 years ago, exhibited splendid natural qualities. He had a quickness of apprehension and a vivacity of understanding which easily took in and surmounted the most subtle and knotty parts of mathematics and metaphysics. He possessed in a large degree that genius which constitutes a man of letters, that quality without which judgment is cold and knowledge is inert, that energy which collects, combines, amplifies, and animates. The rapid progress made in acquiring education and homesteads by the colored people of the South in the face of adverse circumstances commends the highest admiration from all classes. The product of their native genius and industry, as exhibited at county and state agricultural fairs, speak well for the race. At the National Fair, held at Raleigh, North Carolina, in the autumn of 1879, the exhibition did great credit to the colored citizens of the South, who had the matter in charge. Such manifestations of intellectual and mechanical enterprise will do much to stimulate the people to further development of their powers and higher facilities. The colored people of the United States are sadly in need of a national scientific association, to which may be brought yearly reports of such investigations as may be achieved in science, philosophy, art, philology, ethnology, jurisprudence, metaphysics, and whatever may tend to unite the race in their moral, social, intellectual, and physical improvement. We have Negro artists of a high order, both in painting and sculpture; also discoverers who hold patents, and yet the world knows little or nothing about them. The time for the Negro to work out his destiny has arrived. Now let him show himself equal to the hour. In this work I frequently use the word Negro, and shall, no doubt, hear from it when the Negro critics get a sight of the book. And why should I not use it? Is it not honorable? What is there in the word that does not sound as well as English, Irish, German, Italian, French? "Don't call me a Negro. I'm an American," said a black to me a few days since. "Why not?" I asked. "Well, sir, I was born in this country, and I don't want to be called out of my name." Just then an Irish American came up and shook hands with me. He had been a neighbor of mine in Cambridge. When the young man was gone, I inquired of the black man what countryman he thought the man was. "Oh," replied he, "he's an Irishman." "What makes you think so?" I inquired. "Why, his brogue is enough to tell it." "Then," said I, "why is not your color enough to tell that you're a Negro?" "Ah," said he, "that's a horse of another color," and left me with a ha ha ha. Black men, don't be ashamed to show your colors and to own them. End of chapter 29. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. End of My Southern Home, or The South and Its People, by William Wells Brown.